Hi, everybody. Welcome to Possible Live. Welcome if you're joining us for the first time. Welcome back if you joined us for our launch. And I'm delighted today to have our first guest and a returning guest. So, not only is amazing Luiza here with us today for Possible Live, Luiza is also here with us in another couple of weeks. And I am so excited and delighted to introduce you to this amazing, wonderful woman. So while I'm making her blush, today's topic is for Possible Live is cultural insights. And I was delighted in the conversation of talking with Luiza, who is a DEI facilitator. She is a speaker. She is an author. In the process of our conversations, and I really appreciate her, we are talking behind the scenes, and she's really reminding me of the importance of our stories and the importance of our experiences. And it's one of the things that led us to today's topics. But while I'm talking so much about her, let's let her, the amazing, talented Luiza, tell you about herself and her amazing book. Without further ado, here is Luiza.
Well, thank you so much, Mel. You are going to make me blush. But anyway, I am thrilled to be here with you and to have this conversation. By now, obviously, you've heard my accent. I used to joke that this is my Minnesota nice accent because that's where I am. But that's not the case. This accent comes to you via Brazil, where I was born and raised. But I've had some incredible experiences since coming to the United States. I've worked with a lot of international students, scholars, women scientists from all over the world. I've also had the opportunity to have international experiences. I spent the summer in Ukraine a couple of years ago. I worked in Kharkiv, which breaks my heart to hear about, to see the situation right now. I have taken groups of students to Brazil, to Spain, law students to Puerto Rico. Obviously it's not a new country, but it's a very different culture with a different law system as well, and more recently to Japan. So I think of myself as Brazilian by birth, but multicultural by choice because of the incredible experiences that I've had.
And Luiza is always, and she's right. We are so reminded to stay well hydrated today. And in the process of Luiza telling us a little bit more about her, we'd love also to check for those of you who are joining us, and welcome, Clarine. Thank you so much for popping in. Is to let us know, if you can, in the chat or during replays, why is understanding cultural insights important to you? We'd love to know. We'd love your feedback. We'd also love to know, where are you joining us from? And which time zones are you in? It's one of the fun parts about joining us online. And Marie is welcome, Clarine, and welcome back. Welcome back, Marie. She is joining us again. And I really am delighted to have Luiza here with us today. Thank you so much, everybody, for popping in. One of the fun things about this, as Luiza and I were talking about, what are different ways that we could break down some really complex topics. And that's why we really picked the cultural insights. And in the process of doing that, we really were trying to think of what are ways to maybe make it a little easier for us to have a really short, interactive conversation and discussion. So please keep participating. We love that you're here with us. But I'd love to ask Luiza, how can you help us define culture?
Mel, this is so interesting because culture is really hard to define, although it's all around us. It helps, when whenever I'm teaching about culture, I tell my audiences to think of culture as a shared rule book. It's a book with all the rules and regulations that you have to observe. For example, our culture tells us how we greet each other. When I'm meeting you, do I shake your hands? Do I bow? Or do I hug and kiss you? Or how far we stand from each other, how we use time, what kinds of holidays we celebrate, and much, much, much more. For example, breakfast. I was thinking about this the other day. A breakfast in Brazil would probably be, coffee with milk, French bread with butter, jam, or cheese or something. Then when I came here, I had to get used to having cereal for breakfast, which, to be honest, I'm not very fond of. When I was in Japan, I had to get used to having miso soup and rice, steamed rice, and fish and so forth. So our culture tells us, what to do, what to behave, and the important thing to remember is that every one of us, we have our own rule book. And it's also important to fully understand that only when you immerse yourself in a culture that you will be able to fully understand culture, and that takes time and effort. I always teach my audiences to think of culture as an iceberg. Those of you who have had the privilege of seeing an iceberg up front know that an iceberg, what you see is just the top. It's just 10% of the iceberg. The vast majority of the iceberg is below water level. And I equate an iceberg to the top is the surface level culture, and then the bottom of the iceberg is the deep culture. For example, Mel, if I were to invite you to Brazil, if you were going to go to Brazil, you will probably, as soon as you arrive, you will see, you will hear the music, you will taste and smell the food, you will see what sports they're playing, the architecture. You will notice that every kid is probably, playing soccer on whatever field they find. So these are the surface level. However, there's the deep culture that is harder, and it will take a while for understand. For example, how we use time, how we relate to each other, our communication style. So that takes effort on your part and time for you to pick up on that. And the last thing I want to share about culture is that a culture is learned. We learn it from our parents, grandparents, uncles, teachers, and we share that with the newest, a new generation, always changing and evolving. For example, think of the United States in the 1920s and think of it now. Very different. I'm sure you would agree. And culture is really what makes us really unique.
That is fabulous. What I love too is one of the great, besides you teaching us about culture, and I appreciate Clarine answering our earlier question, which was why cultural insights were important to her and why understanding them was important. And she said, as a Black woman, conversations regarding cultural insights are very important to me because I wanted to be respected based on my cultural and respect others accordingly as well, which is like so deep and really profound. And it's one of the reasons why we're here today. I love it too because it reminds me, as Luiza was talking about her accent, or depending on what country you're in, or where you're coming from, or when you're shaking hands. I practiced for many years. I've got a really good handshake. It's a little bit rusty since the pandemic, but I worked really hard on that handshake. I remember years ago in a business class, someone telling me that I was going to be judged by how I shook someone else's hand. And whether in certain cultures, whether I looked them in the eye or
Mhm.
whether I showed proper respect, which is,
Mhm.
the other part of what Clarine is saying. It can be really, really, really challenging.
Yes, and actually, regarding handshakes, that what you just said no longer applies because there are many differences in different groups have different handshakes. Some, are very very light. Others are very firm, and we can't judge them by that. That is, one of the issues we see in workplaces today. We expect individuals to conform to our norms and our rules and forget that there are others.
And I think it's also generational. It was interesting when we were first talking about culture in our conversations, and I really appreciated it. I thought for me, as defining culture, I could think of culture in the beginning as from a family perspective.
Mhm.
I'm from a generation where there wasn't a bring your daughter to work day. It was a bring your daughter to work because you had no childcare day. I remember that first time going with my dad, who worked in New York City. I'm a New York City girl, Bronx girl, but dad took me to Manhattan. He worked for Olin Water Service, and he had a lot of heavy equipment. And I remembered it as a kid because I'm driving in a truck. I had never been in a truck before. He had to belt me in. But I remember him taking me to an office building and walking around the building. And as we walked, there were some people my dad would greet and say hello to. And there were others I noticed they didn't speak to him. And my dad whispered to me, one day you're going to be in a place in situations and you're going to look for people who are there because they're there to help you. They
Mhm.
will always let you know that they see you and that if you needed a hand. And I didn't understand it as a child. Now, as an adult, I realized dad had incredible wisdom, but and it reminds me with my dad's story. My mom was a teacher. She had to go take a test in the city, and I sat in a room while mom took the test, and the reward was going to the UN. And mom took me to the General Assembly, and I remember being so fascinated by those. I was young. They were like big seats, and you could turn a button, and you could hear another language. And I had never seen clocks in different time zones. I didn't understand why there were so many clocks.
Wow.
And my poor mom is trying to figure out, how do I explain military time to me? And she finally gave up. And my uncle came to visit, who fortunately was in the Air Force. And my uncle explained it from my brain. But I think, as you say, those cultures that we're exposed to, whether it's through families or, as neighbors or in schools or teachers. I remember a wonderful teacher, Mrs. Singer in core. She was teaching us about other cultures, and granted, it's like in the ninth grade, but she really took a great time and care, and I loved it because she always allowed us more time for questions than for the content she was sharing. And it was really good. It helped us learn from each other. But I think it's hard too because we don't always learn about culture from our neighbors. We're in our own little pockets or silos, or, some of us are bedroom commuters in our communities and they're on a road a lot. And sometimes we have colleagues in organizations or workplaces who we're not always sharing or not sure that we're listening to each other. But I love that you're reminding us to also listen for the differences, whether it's from speech, whether it's from how we approach each other, how we greet each other. That is an amazing thing. I appreciate you reminding us of that. That the greeting part, I hadn't even thought about that. That's like amazing. Luiza has this amazing smile. So, Luiza, as you're doing this, why did you decide to learn about cultures?
Well, well, first of all, a disclosure. I'm talking about culture in this sense of cross cultures, between Brazil, United States, Japan, and what have you. But you also have to remember that there are many cultures within the United States. There's East culture, East Coast culture, West Coast culture, military culture, corporate culture, courtroom culture. So you have to keep that in mind. Now, why I decided to learn about cultures? Well, first of all, I had to. I had to do that because once I decided to cross culture from Brazil to the United States, very soon I realized that my Brazilian rule book was not working. I was making a lot of mistakes. And I share some of those mistakes in my book. Um, so, and this is the number one sin, so to speak, that individuals who cross cultures commit. They assume that their own rule book will also work in the new destination, and that's not the case. So, in addition to having to, in a sense, I was propelled into it. I think it has to do with my personality. For some individuals, understand differences are scary, and they try to stay away from it. For me, I was drawn to differences. And I always, if you were to use one word, if I were to use one word to define me, myself, I would say I would use the word connector. I'm always someone, I'm drawn to differences and I want to bridge those differences. So I remember when I just arrived in one of my first positions here, as a graduate assistant, I worked in the intensive English program at Iowa State, and I remember writing letters to my parents. Back then we would write, letters. How exciting it was to having met with students from all over the world. Mind you, some of these students I'm still connected with these days, and so I met people from all over the world, and because to me cultural differences were so exciting, and I think that's possibly what led me to the field, to the intercultural field, where I started studying, researching, and writing about cultural differences. And that's why, I also wrote my book, which is Mastering Cultural Differences, Strategies for Leading a Global Workforce.
That is wonderful. And thank you so much for sharing that with us, too. It's a really good reminder of how many amazing resources Luiza has for those of us who are late to the table of participating on social media on the topic. And I shouldn't say late, we're here at the right time. So thank you for joining us. Luiza, I have one more question for you. Why is it important to understand cultural differences?
Wow. I think we no longer have a choice. When you look at what is happening, let's see, what's happening in the United States, for example. Number one, we have increased immigration. Every year you have, thousands of individuals who come in and become naturalized after they meet Congress's requirement of becoming a U.S. citizen. So these are individuals who are going to be living in our communities and working in our organizations. There's also globalization. We are now doing business with individuals all over the world. Between immigration and globalization, we are now in contact with people from all over the world. They are bringing different cultures together. And also, I was thinking about that, technology, the technological advancements that we have today, allows us, it makes it a lot easier for us to collaborate across cultures. For I can have a meeting or I'll be leading a project, and I can be sitting here in the United States. Another partner can be sitting in Sao Paulo, Brazil, another one in Quebec, Canada, another one in Mumbai, China, India, I'm sorry. So we are no longer bound. We don't have to be in the same geographical space so that we can collaborate with others. Another reason why cultural differences are important is that with increased cultural differences in the workplace, the potential for misunderstandings is now much higher. because now we have differences in communication styles. We and these styles may lead to miscommunications, to misunderstandings. We have many different, differences in value orientations that can be misunderstood. For example, take how individuals present themselves during an interview. So if you're part of an interview hiring committee, you may have individuals. If you have U.S. candidates, these individuals have no problem sharing about their accomplishments, bragging about themselves. They're saying, they're raised to toot their own horn, so to speak. That comes naturally, for them. Now, there are other individuals. This is not shared across the globe. There are some groups, what I call, group focused candidates, and I am one of those. Sharing their accomplishments is really something that is very uncomfortable, and we don't do it. Now, when I'm working with doing workshops for corporations, hiring committees, I tell them that they need to see this for what it is. It's a cultural difference and not a deficiency on the part of the candidate. And if they don't recognize that, what is going to happen is it's going to impact their ability to bring more diversity into their organization. So today, you look what is happening in our society. What is happening is, chances are we are working with, supervising, being supervised, or doing business with individuals who have a very cultural orientation that we do. And we need to embrace this diversity so that we can work more effectively across those differences.
I love that you're saying that. You're actually taking me back to, I'll admit it, one of my two most challenging interviews in the days of interviewing for a position. Years ago, I was in the garment industry, and after I'd say one of our first extended recessions caused me to be out of work for quite some time. I had an interview, and I made it to the second interview. The interesting thing about the second interview was it was my first interview in a conference room. What I wasn't prepared for, what wasn't part of the description or of the welcome, and I appreciated it later. It kind of really let me understand the level that I was at. I had an interview with 5 professionals, and it felt like the team huddle was going on at their end of the table, and I was in no man's land. I had thought during the first interview that it was a culture I really wanted to embrace. It was a designer firm, someone had recommended me for the position, but I realized with the intensity from the 5 people on the other side of the table, they weren't expecting me, because the first person, maybe they hadn't mentioned that I was a woman of color. They went totally off of, the resume or the introduction from whoever. And I spoke to 2 people on the phone before this interview, but I remember being so intimidated because I knew that that was a day where I wasn't visible. What I also thought was interesting was the first person, warm, caring, helpful, kind, was nowhere in sight at that table. And it really did tell me a lot about their culture. I remember walking in totally excited with butterflies. But when I walked out, I remember breathing a sigh of relief because I knew it wasn't the culture for me. So I think sometimes it goes 2 ways. It's where opening doors for people or laying out the red carpet, or interviews are 2 ways.
Yes.
And I think that's something, I appreciate that about our interactive dialogues, is that people sometimes forget that in a workplace.
Hmm.
You're asked a question, and the person asking the question isn't really looking for an answer. They
Hmm.
weren't prepared for an answer. And I really appreciate your reminder of some of those things, especially as we talk about in our workplace or in global
Hmm.
settings.
Hmm.
And now as we're having more virtual events, in some places less, as people are reemerging and spending some time in live. But I love also what Clarine is saying, and thank you so much for joining us and hanging out with us, is that you basically said straight up that cultural difference is not a deficiency,
Yeah.
and that part, is really important. It isn't a deficiency for some of us. It's an asset. It's a
Hmm.
flavor. It's a spice. It's a seasoning we're going to bring to the table, to the workplace, to the
Hmm.
encounter, in terms of ideas or innovation. I was smiling because a friend shared an event job with me earlier today, and I wasn't looking, but I read it. Why? A friend shared it. And I looked at the beginning and I really could see why she was thinking of me. And then I loved it because as I got down there, the bonus skills that they were looking for, they were
Hmm.
looking for a fluency in languages. And I
Hmm.
love other languages. But when I was younger, it just wasn't my strength. You know, um, I think of that, in going to school, I had an interest as I was leaving in international business. But in the back of my mind, that might have been something to add to the bucket list.
Hmm.
And I will admit, uh, I will work on trying a language again in case I've removed some of
love
the.
it. I love that for you. You should totally go for it, Mel. And that reminds me of something when I do, intercultural communication, workshops. I always tell the individuals whenever you hear an accent, um, what should go through your mind is that that person is at least bilingual, which nowadays is a tremendous asset. Unfortunately, what happens is individuals hear an accent and they freeze and they stop. And that's why I always start, any conversation, I explain my accent so people can move on, can go past that, because otherwise they just hang up. Oh, she speaks differently. Where is she from? Where's that? I've heard that accent. It's just what it is. It's a different way of pronouncing the words. But people have a tendency to assume that the individuals who speak with an accent don't really understand the language, which is not the case, and it's actually a very dangerous assumption to make. So yes, so I totally go for you. Go study a language. No, go overseas and study the language there. That's what I encourage you to do.
Uh,
You're
I,
much
I,
better.
I have. I have a place in mind. My passport was renewed last month. Grateful for it. It only took 8 weeks. So anybody who's thinking of travel, definitely work on that. Is there something, Louisa, as we're closing out, and I'm delighted you're joining us for Cultural Insights, and that you'll return to join us in a couple of weeks to talk about inclusive leadership. Is there something you want to leave us with on the subject? And please let people also know where they can find your amazing book.
Well, I think my message would be don't be afraid of differences. There's a tendency of, seeing differences as scary. Just see it for what it is. What it is, it's just a difference. And I, as an interculturalist, I live in a world where there are many possible, right answers. So, and whatever difference you notice, see it for what it is. It's a difference. It's not a deficiency, and they need to be taken into consideration. Nowadays, with immigration, globalization, we need to understand differences because the differences are already here in our workplaces, in our schools, in our society. And the only way for us to work better together is to understand those differences, know where the other individual is coming from. In my book, it's on Amazon, Mastering Cultural Differences. It's on Amazon.com. And
Well,
thank
that
you
is
for having me, Mel. I
thank
love
you,
it.
thank you so much, thank you so much. And I always say we should toast across the miles. So let's definitely toast across the miles.
Absolutely.
And I'd love to thank Louisa for joining us today, and to thank you all for popping in to join us today, live or for replays. I
See
hope
you
you all
soon.
have an absolutely magnificent, magnificent day. Be well, stay safe, stay well, stay inspired, and stay in touch. And when you're on the replays, let us know where you're from and what inspired you to pop in today. Thank you so much.